Good evening, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to, for those who don't know, this is Exhibition Research Lab, part of Liverpool John Moores University. Welcome to this venue, welcome to Liverpool Biennial 2018 and to the Serving Library program. My name is Jussi Parikka. I'm here in a sort of double role as part of Liverpool John Moores, running this space, but also part of Liverpool Biennial. So it's particularly pleasurable occasion for me to be here in those two roles while Exhibition Research Lab is running Biennial program. So this is the seventh in the program of talks commissioned by Liverpool Biennial 2018, curating by the Serving Library. In response to the title of the biennial, The Beautiful World, Where Are You? I think we all by now know this phrase really well. Serving Library has invited a number of participants from various fields of practice and disciplines to respond to this title, a call, a question. And today I'm delighted to welcome Jussi Parikka, Professor in Technological Culture and Aesthetics at Winchester School of Art, University of Southampton, and docent of Digital Culture Theory at the University of Turku in Finland. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation and being here tonight. Jussi's work, I just want to say a few things about his work and his publications that sort of leads us to the topic of his talk. So Jussi's work, his research, his various projects, his numerous publications all address a wide range of topics on network culture, aesthetic, media archaeology of contemporary society. He published numerous books, including a hugely influential What is Media Archaeology? And I think this is how I came across Jussi's work first. And then he also published Media Ecology Trilogy with books including Digital Contagions, Insect Media, A Geology of Media, all addressing environmental context of technical media culture. Jussi's thinking, I mean, personally for me, Jussi's thinking and his work remains a major source of inspiration and influence generally in my work and generally, bringing together human and non-human technology and environment, algorithms and insects, all together, finding idiosyncratic methodologies and new ways of thinking. So today, Jussi will talk about the world and its beauty on a global scale through the lens of textile industry. He will look at infrastructures that operate on a planetary scale and that deliver, I quote, beautiful things. The infrastructure consisting of factories, production facilities, routes, networks, logistics that all make up the fashion industry. Entitled The Fabric of the Planetary Surface, the talk takes a recent video installation, Unraveled, by the nomadic design research studio Unknown Fields of Division as a case study. Before I pass on the microphone to Jussi, I would like to thank all those who make this program possible. The Serving Library, of course, for putting together an amazing program of talks. Liverpool Biennial 2018, the team, the director Sally Tallant, Professor Caroline Wilkinson, director of the School of Art and Design at Liverpool John Moores, for supporting generously this space and this program. So Jussi will speak for about 45 minutes, after which we will have time for discussion over drink. And please do help yourselves with drinks at the back, as is our now tradition. And just a few housekeeping things. We have some audience questionnaires on your seats, so if you feel like it, if you can, please fill the questionnaires. They are really helpful for us to plan events in the future and make things work. And I think that's all. And I think I'll pass on to Jussi now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Joasha. Joasha is also very, very modest. You didn't mention a book we did together as well. So I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Joasha across years. So it's really a pleasure to be here again. I'll talk today about machines, chemistry, and labor. I'll talk about machines, chemistry, and labor, but I'll talk about these themes through a particular lens. I will show early on, yeah. Oh yeah.
It's just
I'll early on show a film. There's a couple of free seats at the front because the actual film is ever so slightly too small for this screen, so you might. Oh. Okay. So if you want to move here, there's still a couple of seats. You're going to see it much better. It's going to be the film or the video installation that I'm going to be talking about. I was here during the last Liverpool Biennial as well. I talked about something very different. I talked about something very different. I've been talking about cultural institutions and art practices, and now a project Internet of Cultural Things. The elastic system was the topic last time, and I'm happy to tell that the elastic system, if you happen to see that or have heard about it, is now online on elasticsystem.net. But today, something very different. Today, something rather different. Also today's topic will relate to an AHRC project, hence fashion, something I haven't really worked on before. It's part of an AHRC project, Archaeology of Fashion Film, which in all good ways has pushed me out of my comfort zone, which is actually quite easy to push me out of my comfort zone in all possible ways, to the world of cinema, movement, folds, and fashion. Hence, I'm going to talk about fashion and textiles, even if I can happily say I'm definitely not an expert, but in the project, for instance, with Caroline Evans and Marketa Ulrich from Central St. Martin's, I've had the chance to learn a lot, so lots of thank yous to them. I want to talk about fabrics, fashion, beauty, beauty as produced, beauty as labor, beauty as conveyed across distances. In other words, responding to the call of romantic poetry and 18th and 19th century beautiful souls, such as von Schiller. One harnesses the other side of the long 19th century as scaffolding for this planetary trip of a talk. This other 19th century would then be Marx, capitalism, production, offshore locations, and travels. That is to say, one can excavate from the 19th century thought, multiple threads or solutions to the question of beauty. Pending where to start, the romantic poetry, Naturphilosophie, the political economies of commodity, but also something else as the idea of evolution of beauty as excavated in Charles Darwin's Natural History. It's not something I will talk about though. Or then, of course, the emergence of technical media society since 19th century, emerging from late 19th century onwards, something that also shifts the ways in which we relate to beauty. As Jonathan Crary shows, the classical theories of apperception, sensation, aesthetics that taught us what beauty is turn gradually into the mediated forms of how those sensations can be packaged and hence become discrete units of production and consumption, integrated since the 19th century as part of the what we would now call, or gradually started to call, the culture industry, of course. Aesthetics turns media industry by way of not only classical theories of beauty, but the technical media work of pioneers of media industries, entrepreneurs such as Thomas Edison's. Not that I'm a specialist in political economy or can speak with authority in any way, but I find it necessary to complement as a necessary complementary aspect as a way to start talking about the political economies of location, of beauty, and how our contemporary sense of art and aesthetics is always locatable. So beauty has a place. This is a cheeky and stupid joke, but I had to do this. If I ask Google where is beauty, it tells me at least locations in Winchester. Jokes aside, a more knowledgeable scholar of Marx could easily narrate the ways in which alienation, fetish, factory work, production, and more are at the core of the emergence of the consumer commodity society, which captures then much of discourse of beauty, as we saw. But also questions of location persist. They persist as a central element throughout the 20th century and 21st century. As David Harvey puts it, capital strives to produce a geographical landscape favorable to its own reproduction and subsequent evolution, giving one sentence definition as to why so many cultural geographers have become the key contemporary Marxist commentators. As Harvey narrates, and as history of science and technology aptly backs up, this has meant, in his words, innovations in transport and communication technologies and the subsequent profit opportunities that can be distributed across the planetary space. Or in other words, locations, relocations according to the availability of raw materials or cheap labor. The sort of intensive search that capital performs as part of its primary dynamic, something that also for the past years has been discussed in multiple ways under terms also fashionable, such as Anthropocene, but also Capitalocene. Contemporary forms of art and fashion, design are examples of these dislocations or relocations, these moving sets of objects that define travels of beauty, define beauty as it circuits the planetary space. Perhaps this is a logistical view to beauty, perhaps a media technological view to the Marxist themes. In either case, it highlights the various forms of movement, including across the planetary space. So I want to talk about these big themes through fashion and textiles, through fabrics, through moving images of them, and a recent expedition by the already mentioned speculative nomadic architectural studio Unknown Fields Division, led by Liam Young and Kate Davies. The project produced a video installation, which is a central reference point for my talk, and we're going to watch it soon. The work Unraveled was shot in multiple locations, primarily in Bangladesh and India, shifting views from textile to fabric dyeing processes, cotton fields to yarn production and garments, articulating by way of this 4-screen installation. That's why it's going to look a bit funny, because it's been primed for 4 screens, but you'll see soon. As about fabrics and clothing and labor, fashion, and also what Liam Young has called the planetary conveyor belt. The planetary conveyor belt, which seems a rather apt term also for our purposes, trying to locate beauty. It defines contemporary spaces of production and distribution, aesthetics and technology. Tongue-in-cheek, one can say that this is one big, well-oiled machine of beauty, this planetary conveyor belt. Extended infrastructures of what arranges the parts in seemingly harmonious entities of symmetry, as classical notions of beauty had it. But as critical theory also revealed, it is exactly how the spectacle wants it to be perceived, the sort of smooth functioning where the seeming naturality of it all hides its own stitches and contradictions, histories and struggles, and labor. Let's watch the rather beautiful video itself. Again, one more time, apologies for it being ever so slightly small, but I wanted you to see the 4-screen version instead of just one of them. So I'm probably going to show the whole thing of it, even if it's a bit long, at least major parts of it. I'll continue on top of that as well, but I'll leave it on. A slow walk across the factory floor, model stylishly and gracefully gliding across the space with such elegance that one wonders whether she's a ghostly apparition or actually inhabiting the same high-ceilinged factory space as the workers who are busily immersed in their routines. The simple golden dress, somewhat reminiscent of a sari, is one striking point of attraction as the garment itself moves in the rows of images of movement, while accompanied across the 3 other screens with as intense colors of red and blue and more. The walk across the factory floor is somewhat ceremonial, and while imitating the catwalk of a fashion show, it shows something else that also pertains more closely to the work and travels of fashion as mere end products. It shows multiple layers of materials and production and space and facilities as part of condensation of fabrics of beauty. This improvised catwalk ends up on a beach and a shipyard with massive abandoned rusting cargo ships. Again, the scene seems out of place, even with mismatching modalities and scales, but indicating something essential about the off-screen of the spectacle, about fashion's visual culture that is part of the usual repertoire of how it's being seen. The work and the logistics, infrastructures of fashion as media, fashion as film, fashion as movement that entwines with multitude of other forms of aesthetics of modernity, including that of traveling across geographies. And not merely traveling as leisure and pleasure, but traveling in the form of transport of mass-produced goods. It is the beauty that travels as a package. The video emerges from 2017 expedition led by Liam Young and Kate Davis. It is described as a mix of landscape studies that map the rural conditions of contemporary media cultural urbanization, including the fashion spectacle. It points out the long logistical tale of the creative industries of contemporary aesthetics. And I'm going to read a really long quote from them, but it's really good context, so this following is going to be a quote. For our 2017 expedition, we pick up a loose thread on the garment we are wearing and unravel it across continents, from wardrobe to warehouse, from factory to field, in search of the landscapes behind the runway dreams and street blue jeans. Before we wear them, our clothes make journeys of tens of thousands of miles in their process of production, making textiles the most globalized industry on the planet. The garment trade has for a long time played a critical role in the evolution of developing nations. As labor costs rise in China, we follow the threads and travel through the factory floors and fabric mills, now manufacturing India and Bangladesh. Here, iconic rivers run with the colors of the season, as chemicals used in the dye process are dumped untreated to poison the land along the rainbow banks that will mark our trail from mountains to the sea. As we embark on a waterborne journey downriver from India to Ganges Delta in Bangladesh, we will visit the t-shirt cities and textile valleys that stand from field to factory, and will pick up from vast cotton crops and silkworm cocoons and draw yarns across deafening shuttles as rows and rows of automated looms weave the fashion fads of a distant world. Plain t-shirts, haute couture, throwaway high street chic, all begin their lives in these landscapes. So, let's put this on. The video work Unraveled was part of an exhibition in the early half of 2018 after the end of the world in Barcelona at CCCB. The piece was a part of the group exhibition that was thematically focused on the Anthropocene in theoretical and artistic contexts. It also continued the studio's earlier work on planetary scales of design cultures. Hence, the 4-screen video installation honed in on a different context of audiovisuality than their earlier work. In this case, fashion, but fashion in the extended sense that doesn't merely understand the format of fashion film as part of branding and marketing. Unraveled approached planetary logistics through garments, including some of the post-colonial and neo-colonial context of their production. The images speak of fabrics, but also of the logistical imaginary, including that of location, where to, where from. What sort of movements are these? What sort of a movement is this across the screens? The movement of the fabric as garment, the movement of bodies, the moving images and the movement of beauty as products across the produced space, geographies of the planetary. It is nothing less than this aspect of fabric and garment that I'm interested in. This focus on infrastructures of technological culture of planetary production, one that establishes movement across borders while at the same time relying on specific locations and laboring bodies of color. In Unraveled, sequence of images becomes an expression of that logistical imaginary that include aesthetic articulations of work and supply. So what I'm going to briefly discuss is the installation or the video through notions such as surface and folds, followed up by a focus on the planetary movement as this side of image and fashion, or the fabrics of fashion. So what can we do with this piece of video, this moving image, this attractive set of images? What can we extract from it in terms of our topic? And certain visual elements, that visual cloth and garment, the fabric that covers more than the skin. Certain themes do stand out, and perhaps instead of standing out, they fold and they refold. One can speak of the visual and thematic strands in terms of their folding. The long golden drape of a cloth that occupies space as more than just clothing. It becomes that space, and of that space of labor, extending the body into its architectural surroundings. Across scenes, folds multiply. You see scenes and images of stacks and packs of cloth, fabrics pressed and lined up, machines operating upon material, even the screens themselves as a fourfold operation, multiple scenes of work, movement, folds. Here fabrics become part of logistics, cloth becomes part of the images of standardization, and the imagery extends to multiple levels of production and distribution. Across the 4 screens of the installation, multiple rhythms and materials appear simultaneous. There are threads, cotton plants, machines and movement. There are fabric, cloth, fashion work and sewing. There are stacks of cloth, colored folds, hands at work and the soundscape that accompanies the image. The rhythmic click and clack of machines organizing the tempo of work. Listen to that click and clack. The soundscape of the repetitious, standardized click is what binds factories, film projectors and typewriters together as forms of mechanization and modernization. The standard technological unit from production to product. This is what media theorist Willem Flusser already argued so well. The factory itself is part of the same cinematic lineage where images like clothes are mechanically produced into existence. The click of the factory is what offers one background of a historical fold for this work as well. So speaking of the fold reminds of the legacy of obviously Gilles Deleuze's vocabulary and his notions of the fold that he adopts and develops, and a way of addressing these material realities as a sort of a fractal ontology of multiple scales in one image, for instance. Intertwined, multi-scale and multi-temporal material. And of course, in contemporary theory and aesthetics, it's also picked up in rather influential ways by Giuliana Bruno. In very condensed wording, I just wanted to point out how useful her take is as a reference point again. For Bruno, and perfect for our purposes, the fold marks a connection between cinema, fabric, and architecture. And when it's said cinema, it can be understood in rather broad ways, including video installations as well as embodied movement. To quote Giuliana Bruno, the fold is a piece of geophysic matter that is an actual element of fashion, where the folded surfaces of fashion garments embody an active sense of agency that is not disconnected from the particular skins they are in touch with. As they touch bodies, they also touch and mark topographies. They mark places, they mark vectors of movement. Wearing anything is inhabiting. Spaces and locations become part of those garments. And here the key term is, of course, geophysic. Geopsychic becomes such a useful term for this particular tie to geographies, to locations, to the where question. While the topic of cinema and video, of clothing and space becomes much discussed in contemporary and recent theory, I wonder if this could be extended further on, extended to more extensive scales that still continue to talk about fold and space and surface. The folds of fabrics, for instance, would in this case extend to geographical movements, even planetary scales, and perhaps echoing again Liam Young's words, the planetary conveyor belts of infrastructure. The surfaces would then become part of a wider terrain than individual bodies wearing them, or even architectures, and become territories of political histories, cultural histories, histories of, for instance, colonialism. These folds are spatial, but they are also temporal. So Giuliana Bruno's interest in visuality as a haptic surface, to move from talking about images to talking about surfaces, involves a conceptual and aesthetic thickness, and a thickness that layers also histories. So any kind of a talk about folds and surfaces is a way to tackle those embedded or stratified histories as well. In her words, talking about visual images or surfaces or texts, one can say that a visual text can even wear its own history, inscribed as an imprint onto its textural surface. But we can ask, what histories then? Could these be political histories too? In this context of multiple modalities of thickness of a surface, of an image, for instance, or a fabric, expressed as folds, I'm interested in mapping these post-colonial aspects of the planetary nature of the surface, and the aesthetics of this logistical imaginary, things that travel. These histories might be specific to a particular mode and site of location, the political and social histories of textile factories in Britain and abroad. They might be mediatic, as the various documentaries across the 20th century of, for instance, Lancashire and other factories demonstrate, as various sites of memory of work across different locations and different sites of production as part of histories of capital, but also particular sites of fabrics and work. This thickness, these historical scenes, mediated scenes of documentaries, textiles, hands, often gendered labor, helps to rescale the focus that is inspiringly present in Bruno's work, from architecture to infrastructure, from the urban to its conditions of existence in these rural factories, from cinematic and video screens to the large-scale movement that is established in what is framed in Unraveled, the global logistics that is the extended factory of moving images, of garments moving as packaged units as well. It is this movement, it is this theme of movement and cartography, of geography and the planetary surface, that starts to stand out through these images. I want to also mention another one, because it's a great, let's say, counterpoint into this particular film as well, which is another documentary, or actually more of a documentary, that I'm going to show only a trailer at the back. It's Rahul Jain's Machines. In a similar way to Unraveled, there are indeed other examples like Machines by Rahul Jain. One of these documentary, Machines, as another take on the garment industry in India that features audiovisual contrasts between folds of stacked fabrics, this sort of a recurring imagery that really kept haunting me about stacks or stacks as folds, and the repetitious soundscape in this one as well. It also features multiple cinematic series, or let's say video series, that structure also this film. Scenes of machines and movement, scenes of textiles and their folds, including color mixture processes, but also scenes of exhaustion, of physical exhaustion from labor, of the work, of the tiredness that becomes even further emphasized. What I want to call, and it's not my invention, of course, there's lots of work on the topic, but I want to emphasize as the three pillars of modernity: machines, chemistry, and labor, features in this product, this factory too, presenting a very material take on production of beauty when it comes to colors or themes such as pigments or dyes and fabrics. Machines is shot in Sachin, Gujarat in India, includes also a historical fold too. The region's role in early 15th and 16th century global patterns of merchants and trade of cotton and of contemporary forms of global production of textiles and fabrics and fashion. Indian subcontinent cloth traveled through the networks of the Gujarati merchants also before the colonial Portuguese and other trading companies arrived. As one historian of trade and economy puts it, I quote, "The community of merchants that stretched from Egypt and West Asia to Malacca and Java created a shared market, a trading diaspora, whose reach is evidenced by many of the Indian trade cloths discovered in Southeast Asia that are analogous to those found in Egypt." So this transport of dyed cotton cloth and the desired pattern textile establishes what historians have coined rather aptly threads that bind and webs of materiality. These apt metaphors considering the ties between particular locations, their relation to planetary trade routes, maps of those routes, and the haptic theme of the actual materials that become part of interior decor, whether on walls or in clothing, or in general the global travel of these motifs and patterns that our friends in history of textiles would be able to tell much more about. Maps and cloth become the two sides of this haptic materiality of movement and infrastructure. The merchandise and its routes mapped across surfaces that were essential for the linking and governance of territories. Speaking of these surfaces, and in a longer version of the talk that I've written down as well, I talk a lot about the history of maps also as actual cloth, and the sort of cultural history of maps as mantles and how they already incorporate through a long history, pre-modern history as well, both the vocabulary of hapticity, but also implications of what it means to thinking about planetary surfaces. So even if planetary surfaces is such a theme now in relation to contemporary cultural theory from Benjamin Bratton and others' work as well, there's a long cultural history to how to think about those elements of planetary surfaces exactly as such, as haptic surfaces that are much more than surfaces that we touch with our fingertips, right? But let's return to Unraveled. Oh, these wonderful imageries. It might be just me, but I'm just constantly fascinated by the imageries of folded textiles. These are wonderful films in terms of that. And then the scenes of exhaustion that the film is. And this is from Machines by Rahul Jain. Anyway, so back to Unraveled. Movement produces movement. The cotton mobilizes factories, it mobilizes work, it mobilizes threads and fabrics, it mobilizes dyes and clothes, mobilizes the movement of fashion that is recursively about movement and embodiment. The images of transport boxes alongside the maritime references connect as part of what Liam Young of Unknown Fields Division has indeed again called the planetary scale of conveyor belts. The factories that are locatable and yet connected. The already earlier listed physical locations are tightly glued together by the cinematically established movement across spaces on screen that both map discrete parts of production and demonstrate their links. The moving image here works as one side of articulation of what logistics articulates in terms of space. Logistics as that planetary cinema of articulation. Maps establish temporary operational continuities. Unraveled, of course, forms a link to Unknown Fields Division's earlier work too. One can relate it to the broader infrastructural turn in design, critical design, but also media studies. And is again relevant for our wider themes of location and relocation, and technologies that specify those locations. The Unknown Fields Division's speculative architectural angle addresses non-urban infrastructures, the dislocated city, as they coin it, including the methodologies that perform the role of what is also being investigated. Various data-intensive ways of understanding planetary movement of goods and information. The governing role of logistics and conditions of existence of technological culture. Without going into much detail, the various early expeditions have both engaged with energy, oil and North Alaska, and the role of global positioning systems as enabling technologies, lithium mining in Atacama Desert in Bolivia, or then the geographical sites of emerging technological futures such as electrical batteries, but also transport. I might put this on as well at the back. The existence of transport, which again forms one backdrop to this particular work as well, something that they've dealt with in other projects. Or then rare earthenware project that used mineral processing waste to create a mock luxury object that traveled to the V&A Museum in London from its site of production in China. For sure, the rhetoric of their expeditions as travels can sound overly romanticizing, almost macho, a lone macho anthropological trope, something that Shannon Matten has quite well pointed out as well. These travels that they, in their words, these travels to alien landscapes or to industrial ecologies as the dislocated landscapes that are embedded in global systems that form a vast network of elusive tendrils, twisting thread-like over everything around us, crisscrossing the planet, connecting the mundane to the extraordinary. That was a quote. But it also points to the extended scale at which we need to start discussing things visible. Across the visible surfaces of film and design, things beautiful, things from the cultural industry, to that logistical imaginary at the backdrop, at the backstage of it all. Whether we're talking about fashion, we're talking about design products, or some other products as well. Of course, there's much more to it as well. We need to point out that the assumption of these works as critical gestures that make things visible in terms of infrastructure of planetary industries is not automatically anything liberating, as multitude of NGO work, as a multitude of academic work, as a multitude of other artistic work has pointed out for years. There's nothing scandalously things we didn't know about exploitation of labor or pollution that happens at these offshore sites. So that cannot be the end goal in itself. This is also the point where we need to ask, what role do moving images have? These moving images about work and infrastructure have doing this constellation that hasn't been anymore for a longer time only about space of experience and labor, but the data-intensive ways of governance of those spaces. So what is the role of the cinematic or the moving image in this? Of course, not to dismiss the whole thing. It does matter which images of visibility, well, it does matter what images are visible. If Unraveled is to be considered as part of moving images of fashion, a weird sort of an alternative fashion film, it is that as a piece that strongly emerges from context of critical design and infrastructure, logistics. Perhaps it could be also in the context of Anthropocene called an example of anthropocinema, to borrow a term from Selmin Kara, in how it stages with its moving images across scales and planetary issues in its own fourfolded ways. While it is located in specific sites of work and experience that includes various long histories of those locations and traditions of manual expertise with textiles and dyes, and establishing how they constantly glued and articulated, linked and composed as part of movement of fabrics, it also expresses part of this moving ecology of fashion as well. What images are visible does matter. Including the labor of people of color might itself be one extended way of talking about visibility of what bodies are behind beautiful things that are constantly locatable and relocatable. Of course, to refer to the notion of planetary itself is slightly different than talk about globalization. This is something argued by Gayatri Spivak already. It becomes a way to talk about the planetary, becomes a way to talk about the localizable situations, the localizable bodies and labor and even friction that sets the seeming smoothness of global in action and supporting it. Hence, it is necessary to take literally Spivak's framework for the planetary and to ask in her words as well how to reimagine the planet in its infrastructure, sites and situations that relate to this planetary conveyor belt. What sort of images sufficiently address the multiple scales that overlap from labor to localities to the mechanisms of transport that logistically ensure the seeming smoothness of movement of materials such as fashion garments and apparel. And very briefly concluding, been rushing a bit. Unraveled, I think, works as one example of discussions of how to think about locations of aesthetics and the planetary frictions of beauty as well. It itself is, of course, a very aestheticized fold, a rather beautifully shot, almost overly beautifully shot piece of fashion film. But it speaks to the multiple modalities of beauty in how they fold across the planetary surface from production to the end products. It is this multiple scale of ecology of movement that comes out in also Giuliana Bruno's take on surfaces, but we can expand that to touch the contemporary discussions about the planetary as well. Surfaces of maps or these vectors of movement, vectors of possible movement, surfaces of images as articulations of bodies of fashion spectacles, bodies producing those spectacles, and surfaces of not merely architecture as clothing, as Le Corbusier once suggested, but also as part of the logistical imaginary that runs across factories, shipyards, containers, and more. Movement, textile, cloth, they all fall into the metaphors of interweaved global surfaces. The maritime routes, the maps that enable systematic coordination of ships, materials and products. These become aspects on a moving image of a surface that is distributed across landscapes and their logistical backstage as well. Hence, Unknown Fields Division offers an example of these audiovisual products, of an audiovisual product that uses those aesthetic connotations that might be discussed as moving images of fashion, but it also becomes something more. But it also becomes an investigation to the planetary surface of capitalocene, if you want to use the term, which marks the displacement of the singular human perspective in favor of other scales, other ways of mapping movement across surfaces. It is indeed throughout a slow glide from the factory to the container ship route, a soft touch of the fabric en route from the production sites to the high street. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Discussions. Can I just maybe start by asking you, you make these interesting parallels between, various parallels between materials and materiality, between literal folds and folds as in Deleuze and Bruno, and your own reading of this between materiality of folds and sort of planetary materiality. Could you say a little more about these connections?
I think the fold itself is,
unpacking it a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Also because it's really condensed, because I had to condense a lot of material, and I left out, as mentioned, I left out a lot of material that relate to some of the links between the bits, for instance, about maps as well. So it might have felt a bit fragmented. I think the notion of the fold is really useful because of its literal way of discussing fabrics as well, fabrics and movement as well. But at the same time, like it comes out from Deleuze, but also especially how Giuliano Bruno develops it in relation to visual culture and aesthetics, it becomes a way to talk about rather concrete links between clothing or fashion, architectures, and cinema. Whereas the bits about cinema are not perhaps forefronted in my example, except the fact that we are talking through moving images, which is itself significant. I'm interested in this connection between garments or clothing and architecture. But my kind of a speculative question is that how much, also picking up on people who work in architecture and design and speculative design, how much of the architectural discourse has moved from actual architectural building objects to the longer logistical threads or imaginaries or logistical chains and infrastructures, and in a way trying to see if there's a way in which to talk about the extended connection that a fabric might have, not only to architecture, and Giuliano Bruno makes a very convincing case through her art historical reading of 20th century architecture, but also 20th century, cinema, about that link. But I'm kind of speculating about the ways in which it can move into scales that are, like in this video, speaking of rather central themes, like human-central themes, like labor, but at the same time implying a scale much vaster. And that sort of implication is where I think that the rather material, but also metaphorically rather apt theme of the fold works quite well, because it also gets us to think about in terms of multidimensionality of any two-dimensional screening space and to something else as well. And hence I pick up on that a bit too shortly, but still. Yeah, hi.
You know how you talk about the haptic memories, well obviously haptic is memory of touch, isn't it? So how much do you feel that this film relies on that woman walking and she's got that fabric on? Do you suppose that people watching actually imagine themselves with the touch of that fabric?
I think, I don't know, do you? It might be, frankly, just me. I think there's something in terms of the rather striking scenes in terms of besides the fact of haptic in relation to experiential states, like for instance what you just described, which I think is could be a rather apt way of seeing as well. I'm interested in how it folds as part of space, in terms of how it takes space, and how it folds as part of more than just skin, for instance, in those factory scenes, but also in these scenes as well. So I'm kind of interested in that interface in between the connotations that come through the idea of wearability and clearly on sites that are about labor, for instance, right? And then the stuff that is not just experiential in terms of spatial set. So I think there's a lot going on there in terms of that. And I think in general, and this would be a bigger question in relation to the project in which we're discussing these themes, which is on archaeologies of fashion film with Caroline Evans and Marketa Ulrikova. In terms of fashion film itself as a particular genre, perhaps quite often mostly a marketing or branding genre, but still interesting aesthetically because of the double bind of movement of garments and movement of the cinematic that produces certain kinds of perhaps haptic sensations in that way as well.
So is it,
Yeah.
sorry.
That's
So
okay.
Is it literally the gesture as the fold brings two things to touch that otherwise wouldn't have? That's the kind of the touch. It's almost the haptic thing that you're chasing, you're expanding the same film, like
Yeah.
the edit, the bringing
Yeah.
the edit.
Yeah, I think there's something, besides the idea that it's sort of a like, intuitively it does bring to mind any kind of a and the really great discourse that's been on for a while as well about haptics and touch in relation to cultural and aesthetic theory, and for good reasons as well, that it brings to mind this sort of a like scale of the body and scale of embodiment. I am interested in how it also extends outside the body and problematizes the idea that it's just about the singular body that is being sheltered by clothing, for instance. And that's sort of a thing I'm trying to figure out as well, partly in this example. So yeah. And hence it becomes conceptual also in terms of its links as well. And then because there's these scenes that are really great as well, and it might be that I'm really like, it's very idiosyncratic of me, but like, this is from machines, Rahul Jain's machines, but like there's multiple scenes of, just stacks of folded cloth.
Can I just ask a question? Just the way that you flicked through there also just made me realise I wanted to ask.
Oh yeah?
But so there's something that I find a little bit like worrying when you think about planetary scale aesthetics, or the kind of production of critique which supports like planetary scale aesthetics thinking. Just because I think as well in the way that you just, so some people are going to have much more access to that. Do you understand what I mean? So the ability to conceive of logistics, but in a purely aesthetic way. And I mean, I don't know whether that has any bearing on material reality, but the fact is that it feels a little bit like, again, piece, labour, and all this production. If you can see the whole machine working, there's something which is very sublime about and very beautiful, and very like what's the word? So the way that we just flicked through those images also, exactly.
Yeah.
We also flicked through this image, which is the kind of material reality of the massive machine, which we also feel as if we have a conceptual hold on, and therefore feel a bit, attracted to in its multiple manifest workings. Does that make sense? So, I guess the question is then, what happens when you put this kind of planetary scale aesthetics next to fashion, and what happens to kind of an osmosis of beauty into, I don't know, like in between those two. Am I making sense? Because I think it brings up a little bit on your discomfort at the fashion part.
Yeah, and I think there's sort of a like thing about these images, looking at still images, but in terms of moving images, I think it applies to both. Even if we saw a really short glimpse of the machines by Rahul Jain, I think it was on BBC as well. At one point, I don't think it's on iPlayer anymore, but if you try to find and watch it, it's really great. It's more emphasized perhaps in relation to these aspects of exhaustion, for instance, as well, which I think are slightly more less explicitated in Unraveled, but I think in both cases they are there as well. And I'm somehow trying to figure out, and for instance, Gayatri Spivak's term, why to talk about the planetary, for instance. Her way of kind of understanding the planetary was exactly to ensure that the globalized imagery of the logistical doesn't become a smooth and glossy surface of a well-oiled machine, but instead is localizable in terms of its sites of production, which are constantly articulated. And of course, this is very low-tech of us to discuss these images in video, whereas we could talk about the very abstract computational levels of the logistical, which itself would be another further layer as well to this, but this is I was already too fuzzy in my talk, so I didn't want to start making it even fuzzier. But yeah, and it's something about those continuities between scales of laboring bodies and at the same time trying to understand what are the forms in a very Marxist sense, but perhaps something aesthetic as well, or let's say put it into that there's something interesting for aesthetic theory as well, of what are the forms of abstraction in which those laboring bodies are being articulated sometimes rather concretely in relation to machines, operating machines for instance, but also articulated as parts of this planetary conveyor belt. And I think it's somewhat a kind of a crucial theme also for a lot of aesthetic and cultural theory, trying to articulate this both extremes almost as well. The necessity of talking about abstractions is, I feel, one of the most urgent things we need to be doing, because it's on the level of abstractions that capitalism, logistics and so forth works. And at the same time, it's not about laboring bodies in specific locations and the sort of a rather what's the word I'm looking for, the Foucauldian disciplinary regime of factory work that is part of it as well. Any more questions?
It's a discussion, it's not a question. No, I think I was just thinking about it in terms of the pleasure, the pleasure of conceiving of planetary scale aesthetics, which for me a little bit is related to the pleasure of a zoom. You know, so because you can conceive of the wide scale, and then you can zoom into how the nuts and bolts. So I can conceive of
completely. I completely.
And it's the pleasure part of that. Which I guess I was pointing to.
Absolutely. And the sort of a imaginary of the global as well as a sort of a interconnected whole ecology in itself as well, which
it also kind of rests on an anti-capitalist conception, let's say, from theory, right?
I'm sure there would be a lot to unpack there in terms of, again, the long history of both Marxist and other sorts of critical thought as well, in terms of what are the sort of what's the term from Jameson that I'm thinking about? The forms of cognitive mapping that are necessary for the situations which are beyond mappable because of the vast scale of them as well, and what sort of imageries are we offering as solutions for that vast scale, right? Hence the sort of perhaps importance of images in that sense as well, because they can articulate multiple scales at the same time as trying to capture that vastness of the scale that is not just about one image, but also how it comes about. And you just also nailed it in terms of the perverse pleasure of this sort of genre, even sometimes of a critical genre of production of planetary imageries, and it's something that needs to be noted as well. Absolutely.
You've mentioned this film as part of an exhibition that was shown in CCCD. I think this exhibition is actually coming to Liverpool.
Oh, really?
In the spring. Mark would know. At FAB, isn't it?
Blue codes,
so you can see this is an installation. I saw it actually as forced installation. It was quite amazing. So.
Yeah, they're probably, exactly. Anthropocene and all that.
Okay, should we continue with a drink maybe?
I'm sure there's drinks left.
There's loads of drinks at the back, so please help us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your patience.